Hey, welcome back to County Talk. We're going to do another episode today. And just to remind you, this is when we do a deep dive into the county services, so you better understand what we're doing and what we're doing with your taxpayer money. And we want to make sure that you're as informed as you can be. So we're here today. I'm Sue Hansen. I'm one of your elected officials, elected county commissioners. And I'm here with another elected official, Brad Hughes, who's our county assessor. And I have to say that this is the most complicated job probably in the county. And so when people say, because I was getting my hair done once and the lady said, "So what do you do for the county?" And I said, "I'm a county commissioner." And she goes, "What is that?" It was like a silent pause. And I said, "Do you know what that is?" And she goes, "No." And I go, "Okay." So she goes, I said, "Do you know what I do?" And she goes, "Commission." And so I don't know if people say you assess, but it's complicated. And so we're here to make it a little simpler so we can all understand when you get your property tax bill, what does that mean? So Brad, tell me first a little bit about your background, what brought you here. You've been in office a long time, so you have the confidence of the voters. You keep getting reelected. But let's start with your background.
Sure. Well, I started in assessment right out of college. My uncle was actually the assessor in Steamboat Springs, and he was leaving office, and I was looking for a full-time job, and so I became a residential appraiser in Routt County. After that, I moved to Jefferson County and worked there for a few years, and then in '93, I moved to Western Colorado, and I was the chief appraiser in Ouray County. I was a commercial appraiser for Mesa County. And then finally in 1998, I ended up in Montrose County. And so I was the deputy assessor for 8 years, and then I've been the elected assessor for the past 18.
Wow. So yeah, I mean, I didn't know that, and I think that's really great that you've had a really broad picture of a lot of the counties on the Western Slope, and also a larger county with Jeffco. I'm sure that was interesting. So you knew right out of the start when your uncle was an assessor, you're like, wow, that looks like a cool job, or yeah.
Well, my first job opportunity was in Las Vegas. I was in the accounting department of the Dunes, and that really didn't work out living in Las Vegas. So he said, "You should probably come back and get a real job."
Yeah, a real job. Yeah, exactly. Las Vegas, not really your style, as I know you. So you've been with the county a number of times. How many times have you been reelected?
I'm on my fifth term right now.
Fifth term. So for people that, the county commissioners are term limited, but the assessors and the other electeds can run continually.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing because, there are some county assessors that are term limited, and this job takes a while to learn it and get to know it. And so by the time you learn it, you're term limited and you can't really be effective anymore.
Right, and I think you're right. I think this is the kind of job that this is not just getting elected for policy. You really have to understand how the property tax works. You have to be able to understand all that legislation that goes along with it. And I know you follow all of that. So a normal day for you is like what?
Well, I mean, depending on the cycle of what process we're in during the year, that's one thing about the job that's interesting is there is no normal day. Right. I mean, the only thing I'll say is normal is a lot of emails, a lot of phone calls, a lot of meetings. Mm-hmm. But besides that, sometimes I'm doing reappraisal work. Sometimes I'm handling separate projects, different boards I'm on, all kinds of different variety.
Yeah. Well, I think that, you have to keep your hands in the community. You have to know what's going on in the community. And as the property assessor, people have questions, and it is difficult to convey what it is that you do for those of us who are math challenged or even tax challenged. But so it's nice that you don't have a normal day. The same with county commissioner. That's like I keep telling people think this job is boring. There's nothing routine about this job.
Absolutely,
there's something always going on. So let's talk a little bit about what an assessor does, what the role is, and why that's so important.
Okay, so the way I look at it, there's two major functions that an assessor does. And I think the most important and primary one is obviously we have to value all of the real and personal property within a county. And you say, well, why is that important? Well, those valuations are used by the taxing entities, and from those valuations, they apply their mill levy to generate their tax revenue. And so really, if there wasn't assessed values, you couldn't operate local government.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so you mentioned the taxing entities. So we always think of when people talk to me, they're like, our properties are too high and our property taxes. But there's a lot that goes into when you get your bill. It's not just the county, right? So we're going to talk
Right.
about that in a minute. But
Yeah.
some of these other taxing entities, how many of them are there
There's roughly 34 taxing entities in Montrose County.
that all come together onto one tax bill, right? So,
Well, it all depends on where you live, right? Whichever geographic tax area your property falls into, that's who you pay into.
okay. When you think about, okay, I buy a house, what's it valued at? I know what I paid for it. I know that's very different. So let's get into the nitty gritty about kind of how that all works. How does the process work from the beginning to the end?
Well, one other thing that I didn't mention, another role of the assessor, let me finish that question, is we have to maintain the current ownership on all properties, right? And people don't realize that, but that's a huge job.
What does that mean?
That means that all roughly 29,000 properties in the county, we have current ownership on those. And so that means that my staff, they actually look at all the deeds that come through the recording office and transfer ownership on those properties. And that way the tax liability gets given to the right person. And so there's a lot to that. We're processing thousands of deeds per year to get the ownerships correct. And that's a big portion of my staff's resources to do that job.
So I sell a house, then it comes through your office because at some point you have to sign the right deed, whoever I sold it to. So it gets transferred.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's, when you look at ownership, current ownership in the assessor's office, right? Whether it be on our maps or in our records, that gets there because we look at the recorded documents and transfer those ownerships. And it's a lot more complicated than you might think. There's a lot of subdivision of lands. We have to split all the properties when all these subdivisions are created. Transfer from ownership into trust. I mean, there's just a lot of details. When someone dies, death certificates are used to transfer names. There's just a lot of steps.
Yeah, and also, I'm assuming as an assessor in your early career, you very detail oriented. You have to be willing to. I mean, you get into the nitty gritty of these things, right? So you have to be accurate. Because nobody's
Absolutely.
going to enjoy having somebody else's property tax bill, right? So when you're looking for people to work in your office, you're looking for folks that have that attention to detail. Would that be an accurate statement?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've got a great staff. They've all, got a lot of years of experience, and it takes that to work in the assessor's office, whether it's the administrative or the appraisal side. I would say it takes at least 2 years before you can operate independently.
Wow, that is a lot of training. So when you determine, well, first let's chat about this a little bit.
Well, I think the only thing I wanted to mention on here is a lot of people, since obviously Montrose County actually assigns the valuations, the treasurer collects the taxes. People want to know, well, where do those tax dollars go? And currently in Montrose County, the breakup is about 40% of your taxes go to the schools and 30% to the Montrose County, and the remaining 30% to all the special improvement districts, the fire districts, the library districts, the water districts, those entities.
Do you find that people don't fully understand how this works? So when people are upset about their property tax, do you have to do a lot of explaining to folks?
Oh, absolutely, right? I mean, a lot of them think that money goes directly to the county, right? Because it's the bills are coming from Montrose County. But really, that's not correct, right? Only 30%, 70% of those property tax dollars are going somewhere else in Montrose County.
Yeah, and I think that was a big eye-opener for people when I first got into office, that when people were complaining about their property taxes. And then, of course, this year when the valuations were so high that people thought the county had this windfall of all this money. But that wasn't the case, was it?
Correct.
Yeah. So again, I want people to understand that these improvement districts, the rec district is one of those. The URA, is that correct? Okay,
No,
not exactly.
Not really.
So, but the taxing rec district, fire district, all those are taxing entities, and the library also gets a portion of your tax bill too.
Correct.
Okay. So how often? So did we get through because the start to finish? So
let's start
go
with
back.
that process. And so the way that it works, and it's fairly complicated, but I'm going to shorten it up for us, okay? So another thing that we do is we get all the building permits, city and county. And so we get about 600 per year. And so my staff goes out, They inspect these properties, they look at the building plans, they photograph them, they actually put them on the tax roll. They put them in our computer system. So now you've added all this new construction in the existing homes that are out there. Then we look at the sold properties and we confirm those sales. Are they good arm's length transactions that we want to use to set valuations off of? Once that's done, we actually build a valuation model and we value the sold properties, okay? To where statistically we're very close to what those sold properties were. And then we apply that same model to all the unsold properties. And that's how your values are set. They're set on actual sales that have occurred in our county. And so that's how residential works. It's the biggest portion of our properties, 18,000 residential properties we have. And so, we're using about 3,000 sales to set the value on 18,000 residential properties.
Okay. And is that typical for other counties that do this exact same thing? Is that the same process?
Yeah, it's called a mass appraisal method,
Okay.
which is, it's a way that you can value a large population of properties, right? It's not like when you go to Wells Fargo and get a home loan and they select 3 or 4 individual comparables, adjust them, and you have an appraisal. This is a mass appraisal valuation.
Okay. So, and when somebody comes and says, because when you're doing a mass appraisal, there's going to be some things that need to be adjusted. So you have someone come and you have a mechanism for people to not object, but to ask for, is this really what my home is worth, as opposed to, so you do work with the public in terms of helping them understand how that is derived. And then maybe there are some adjustments that you could make as an assessor, but that's a process that comes at the end of the property tax when the bills go out?
Well, in Colorado, we reassess every 2 years, okay? Each odd year. So in 23, we did a reappraisal. We're going to do reappraisal in 2025. So we're going to use sales that occurred basically January of 23 through June 30th of 24. Those new sales are going to set the new valuations. We're going to send out notice evaluations to all of our taxpayers May 1st. And then you have from May 1st to June 8th to appeal your valuation or classification. So yes, annually you're allowed to, at 1 month out of the year, come into our office, talk to our appraisers, tell us what your concerns are, and we will take a look at your valuation.
Is it difficult to get it right? I mean, I know you use a mass appraisal, but is it? It's a lot of responsibility to value that many properties in a county. How do you sleep at night?
Well, it is tough, especially outlier properties, right? I mean, typical neighborhoods are fairly easy because there's a consistent kind of pattern what people are willing to pay for these properties. But, you get out in the county and there's a variety, large homes next to single wide manufactured homes, and that gets a lot more difficult when you're setting a mass appraised value.
Right.
But, the one thing that we have to do, and this is all 64 counties, is those values are audited statistically, right? So we look at a median sales ratio, and our values have to be within 5% plus or minus of those sales. And so, there's a lot that goes into it to get those values. We have a lot of ways to adjust neighborhoods. We adjust based on age, square footage, location, views, amenities. I mean, there's a lot of factors that come into that valuation.
And your appraisers would go out there and actually take into consideration all of those factors when they're looking at it.
Exactly.
So that's very time consuming, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's very time consuming. That's why you need a good educated staff and
Yeah. One thing I've noticed about your staff is they're passionate, and of course I'm thinking you're passionate about assessing, okay. But they are. They're
Absolutely
dedicated, loyal, and excited about what they do, which I think is really cool. So anything else in that process that from start to finish that we want to make sure that we cover before we move on?
I think that's
Okay.
covered a lot of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are the misconceptions? What do you run into? What do people not understand about the process?
Well, I guess when I see appeals come in, right? I mean, yes, we do adjust properties. There are errors that are made. But a lot of people, they just get sticker shock, right? They see that and say, my property can't be worth that. Value too high. But there's no foundation, there's no basis, there's no documentation. So that's why we try to make all the sales available. We sit and talk to people, show them actually the sales that occurred in their area so they can, see the data themselves. A second thing is, I'll get to it here in a little bit,
Okay.
but I do want to show you another misconception on
Okay.
appeals.
Okay. All right. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to talk about?
Well, let's go. You kind of asked me about the whole process, and this kind of relates to that.
We put this simple formula up so everybody could.
This is actually a very simple formula.
Okay,
but and we're going to keep it simple because starting next year it gets more complicated with the legislature. But we're not going to go into that today.
Okay.
But basically, one misconception is that the assessor sets your taxes. Right? I hear that all the time. Right? You've raised my taxes. Well, no. The assessor sets your valuation. Okay, and so a market value is what my office does. You multiply that by an assessment rate, which the legislature sets,
Right.
to get an assessed value, multiplied by a mill levy to get your taxes. And so there's three components to make up property taxes: market value, assessment rate, and mill levy. I'm charged with following the market up or down, right? Whether it's going up, down, flat, it doesn't matter. We're using sales that have occurred. The legislature is the one that can raise or lower mill levies, especially with the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment. Okay. And so over the last few years, obviously they've done some things by adjusting actual values, adjusting assessment rates a little bit, but they have some control there on how much what your taxable value is. Ultimately, it's the taxing entities though that set their mills, and the summation of those mills is your total mill levy, and that's what's multiplied against your taxable value to get your tax amount. So, for example, this last reappraisal cycle, when we had these 40-50% increase in market values, you would expect that either the assessment rates would be lowered or the mill levies would be lowered. Now, some entities did lower their levy, but some of them did not as well. And so we did see some districts get some fairly substantial increases in revenue. And so that's the one thing that the taxpayers really need to know, is that it's the taxing entities that ultimately, you look at their budget from prior year, you look at their next year budget, and how much revenue increase are they going to have?
So just to recap, so you determine the market value,
Correct.
and then the assessment rate is given to you by the legislature sets the assessment rate.
Correct.
And we just had recent legislation that when Gallagher went out, and now we had the new one, so that was adjusted, and then that gets the assessed value.
Correct.
So it is pretty simple. So
Yeah,
thank
it
you
is.
for walking me through that. Now I feel better. And then each entity, just like the county, we set our own mill levy, which we're about to do in a week or so. Set the mill levy or approve that, and then that multiplied by your assessed value will be what the tax you pay.
Correct.
So my guess is that people are never unhappy when they see the valuations when they're selling their property.
Oh, absolutely.
But when they're paying their taxes, that's the part where it causes heartburn. But I think it's really important to note that the other taxing entities have the flexibility, as does the county, to raise and lower the mill levy, which would affect your ultimately on the tax bill.
Well, exactly. I mean, there are some taxing revenue limitations, right? The Tabor restrictions and the 5.5% revenue restrictions. And then there's going to be a new restriction that if those entities have lifted those two revenue restrictions, they'll be subject to a new 5.25% restriction now with this new legislation. And so, what I think is going to happen is these entities will have to go back to the voters and ask to collect this additional revenue, or else there will be some sort of cap to what they can collect.
Right. So, I know that when the assessed values started coming in and we saw how much our values went up, people were accusing the county of, oh my gosh, what are you going to do with all that money? And I think that goes back to the first slide where we
Right.
had the pie chart so that you understand that we just get a portion of that, and the smallest portion.
Correct.
Right. So if I'm a property owner and I don't like what I see, what do I do? How do I come to you?
Well, like I said, you'll get a notice evaluation in May of all reappraisal years. And there's detailed instructions on the back, but basically you can, I recommend that before folks would pursue an appeal, they do some research, right? We make all the sales available. We've got good residential sales maps showing properties on the web that actually sold in your neighborhood.
Oh.
And so that's been very helpful, right? I mean, once you can see the data,
You're like, oh,
you may not like it,
yeah,
but it is what it is.
right, right. And ultimately, that'll benefit you when you ever sell your property or something like that, right?
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it's not a bad thing that your property's going up. It was just that such a huge leap this year with that adjustment.
Absolutely.
And I think what had to do with Gallagher. I mean, the legislators didn't replace Gallagher, so even the commercial businesses got hit pretty hard this year too.
Well, the increases really, I mean, obviously, post-COVID, that sales period was basically July 1st of 2020 through June of 22 before interest rates increased. And so there was a lot of market activity. There was a lot of people relocating, a lot of people moving, bringing prices up. So kind of, I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but future trends, obviously, what are we seeing for this next reappraisal cycle? Well, yeah, this isn't that, but what we're seeing now is that the volume of sales is down, but the prices are not down. Okay. And our vacant land has been up substantially. So we're going to see some big increases in 25 for vacant land and some pretty modest increases in commercial property because the Montrose market is still doing well commercially as well.
So speaking of vacant land, I've noticed that when we originally bought our property, it was empty and it was resident, it was ag, and the taxes were a lot lower. And then as we built houses and things like that, it changed. Tell me about why that is.
So we could do a whole session on agricultural classification of property, but I'll just give you the short answer.
The down and dirty?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So in Colorado, it's pretty straightforward. Residential property is valued only based on a sales comparison approach. That's in statute, right? So we have to look at sales. Commercial property, it can be valued on a sales comparison approach, a replacement cost approach, or an income approach. Agricultural land is valued on an income approach, but it's valued on income as its productivity as a crop or grazing property. And so obviously, maybe in eastern Colorado or western Kansas where people buy ag land at ag income rates, it makes sense. But, obviously in an area like this, the market value is a lot higher than the agricultural productivity value.
Right.
And so what normally would be a $10,000 per acre farm maybe will be assessed at basically $1,000 an acre. And so the legislature did that decades ago, basically to keep food prices down, right? So that the farmers and ranchers did not have to pay a huge tax liability, and that was the goal of it.
Okay, so it was to benefit farmers.
Exactly.
Interesting. That I didn't know that.
Yeah.
See,
Right.
every day I learn something new.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about the trends if you're ready for that. What do you see going into the future?
Well, this is a good time to take a look at this graph, Sue. This was the last reappraisal cycle in the Bear Creek subdivision. Okay. So sales from June of 2020 through basically, well, that's not really right. That was a 2-year period.
Okay.
Okay. So those are very similar homes. They're the same homes. They're similar model homes. I mean, it's really easy to understand that. That what changed? Well, the quality of the homes didn't change. The only change was time, right? And so those same homes that were selling in 2020 for $175 a square foot, by the end of the cycle, we're selling for $275 a square foot. And so, when people would bring sales in to appeal, they might be bringing some of these sales from 2020 in. We're setting values at an appraisal date, right? A pinpoint in time. June 30th of 2022 is when these, or 24 is when these values are going to be set. And so, you have to adjust for market conditions, right? There was a 2% a month appreciation going on during this period. And so these older sales had to be time adjusted upwards so that we could actually use them because the market was increasing.
Oh, I see.
Right. And so when someone would go to their realtor and they would give them a printout of the sales in their neighborhood, they were unadjusted. So the people felt that their properties were overvalued. But when you start looking at the June of 22 sales, they were a lot higher than the 21 sales.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have because all things being equal, and to assess it, so you have to bring these folks that paid less per square foot up to the same level.
Correct.
To get an accurate evaluation.
So we apply a time adjustment to these older sales, which we statistically can figure what that time adjustment was. It brings those sales up, and that's a flat line across there instead of this graduated line.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that means that and you could take, I mean, to do Bear Creek subdivision is easier because of, as you said, the similar housing, similar
Right.
size lots, and all of that. Much more difficult. So when you said on the county, it's much more individual. Does the assessor have to go out individually and take into all these things, like you said, the view? It's got to be more complicated.
It is a lot more complicated. I mean, this is just one little example, but we do break it down by economic area, competing neighborhoods. I mean, we break it down a bunch of different ways.
Right. It's really interesting. So
Yeah,
not
I
that
love
I
the
ever wanna
math
be-
side of it.
Oh, you love the math side of it.
Yeah, that's my favorite part of the job.
So that's how you knew you wanted to be assessors, your math skills. Yeah, it is to me more interesting when I can apply it to like real world stuff. And when we see our tax bill, I'm always like, so what does that mean? And so that the formula helps, and it was simple. So I hope that helps you too. So
Right.
so let's talk a little bit about your challenges going in the future, and then then we're going to get on to something more fun. Not that your job isn't fun, but the time capsule. So, what are your challenges? Is it, besides the legislature? I'm sure that's a big one.
Well, that's been the hugest challenge, right? Is it seems like we're getting away from market values and we're going to these manipulated type values. In 23 and 24, the legislature applied $30,000 adjustments to improved commercial properties, $55,000 to residential properties. Starting next year, they're going to split assessment rates. So that formula is no longer going to really kind of apply. I mean, the school districts are going to pay, you're going to pay more to the school district than to the other taxing entities. Then starting in 26, there's going to be multiple actual values because the non-school government portion of your actual value will get adjusted by 10% of the first 700,000 in value. And so we're going from basically one market value, one assessed value, to three actual values: a full value, a school value, and a non-school value, and a school assessed value, and a non-school assessed value. So it's becoming a lot more complicated in Colorado how to deal with property taxes and values. And that's what I don't like is the assessor. It's pretty clean to just set your value. When you start making adjustments to that value, people don't really know what that number is anymore.
Well, we've gone from a simple formula now to the simple formula plus 50,000 or whatever the adjustment's going to be set by legislature, right? Does it frustrate you that the legislature, I mean, I know they're trying to fix an issue, but maybe that doesn't really fix the issue because it's sort of like the problem with Gallagher originally was a problem, right? And so, but it did bring the property values down for folks.
Correct.
But we didn't replace it, and so we ended up with this, jerry rigging kind of a formula that we think is going to solve the problem. But
Right.
so long term, your philosophy would be just don't muck with it. We should have just left it.
Well, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
all of these changes were reactionary to those big increases in 23. I know there was some legislation to just skip that reappraisal and let that blip go up and back down and not change people's values. But, unfortunately that didn't happen. And so we have where we're going now.
Yeah, and on the last thing on this before we hit the time capsule, that Montrose County is still our property taxes are still Tabor limited, and so we did not, even if we got a bump in the property tax revenues, we would have had to give that back to the taxpayer because we have a limit that we can achieve. Correct. So that was also something we spent a lot of time trying to educate people on, and that we didn't have a windfall, and that was a very different experience with some of the other taxing entities.
Yeah, the thing that I'll talk about the county, I mean, they're the one taxing entity that still has their Tabor restriction for property tax in place. And so you might look at that and say, okay, well, how much did that restrict Montrose County? But you still have to realize that with Tabor, it's a pretty simple calculation, really, right? You get to collect for new construction, right? So all the new taxpayers coming on, the county can collect on that additional revenue or that additional assessed value that's coming on the tax roll. The other thing is inflation is involved, right? And inflation's been fairly high. So, that makes sense, right? If you can account for new growth and inflation to keep up with cost, that's a reasonable increase. But some of the entities that have lifted that tabor, they did get very substantial increases in their tax revenue.
Yeah. It is a complicated issue to help people understand, but I hope this has been useful, and it's been helpful to me. I've never really sat down with you and talked. I've talked antiques, but not talk about actually how this works. So I appreciate that. So let's switch.
Sure.
As you know, we're remodeling the courthouse, and you were as an aficionado of antiques and collector of old things. You were especially interested in this time capsule, and I believe this cornerstone was in your original office down there at the courthouse. Was that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It's. I mean, we knew it was in there somewhere, and I can still remember the first time when we were looking at the ceremony. I mean, 2 years ago when they were talking about it, and the gentleman that came in and met with me and the former county manager said, "Well, we might need to get there a couple hours before so we can take that thing out."
A couple hours before.
Exactly, before the ceremony. And so I think they were really going to do some demo work, but anyways.
On a cornerstone
exactly.
of the courthouse, yeah.
So, I did a lot of research before they found it. And what's interesting is if you were at the actual ceremony, they had a mocked up sample of where they received it from. And that's exactly what we did our research on and knew where it was.
So where did you do your research? Like newspapers or what? I mean, how did you find
Yeah, absolutely.
that? Wow.
Yeah, I did all that research well before the Stryker folks did and knew what was in the box. And, I did find out that a time capsule was actually invented after this, right, in the 30s at the World Fair. So this cornerstone items, I don't know that they were really intended in 100 years, you're supposed to take this stuff out. They thought someone eventually would find it, and they did.
Right. And it is interesting. I mean, it was not an easy task because there had to be some chipping away, but Zane Brown really, and I'm sure you were right there with them, but it's interesting how important this was for him to find.
Absolutely.
And then when he found it, it was like, like a kid in the candy store. All right. But you do, you have an affinity for collecting old things. And I think if anybody has stopped by your office, and I don't want to get everybody charging to your office, because you don't have everything set up in your current office. But once you're back in the courthouse, it'll be back on display. But it was always, it's like you walk in and there's like, what's that? And so things that make you curious and want to know a little bit more about history. So you've always loved history. Is this kind of one of your avocation?
Yeah, I have. I've always loved history and old things. I got a minor in history, and I love history.
Cool. Well, I and I know your wife appreciates all your little trinkets. So, but tell us these are some of the things you found. Here's Brad. Obviously, look, it's for one of his smiling. So, and Zane, who also did instrumental in finding this unique treasures. I was struck at how. Now, I love history too, and I like antiques, but I was bummed out that it wasn't more exciting. So, I mean, when we start thinking about what goes in the next time capsule, I think we want to make sure there's some really exciting things. I don't know.
I would agree.
Okay.
I would agree.
So it was a little underwhelming, but cool nonetheless, because at the time, this is what they thought was important. Do you want to give us a little rundown of what you found and what was there?
Well, I mean, the thing about it is we knew we had an itemized list of what was in there, so it really wasn't surprising what was in there.
To you?
Mean,
but
yeah.
Okay.
To me, it wasn't. But I guess some of the interesting things that I recall are, think about it. You have the history of Joseph Selig as written by his nephew Hugo Selig, which he put that in there, and it was cool to be the first person to pull it out, right?
Yeah.
And a handwritten history. Another thing I really enjoyed was that picture of the Hartman Brothers garage.
Yep.
that's a famous Montrose picture,
It
right?
is.
It's on all the local history books, but no one knows who those individuals were, from the janitor to the mechanics. I mean, yes, they probably knew who the Hartman was because he's the guy wearing the suit and the hat, right? But the other guys, no one knew who they were. Now we do.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So
It's like the rest of the story.
exactly.
Yeah, I love it too. I mean, I think that it was interesting to see names that we would recognize today that from 100 years ago. And so they were prominent citizens then, and still those families are here, which, I don't know that. I didn't grow up in the same place. So, as a military brat, moved around a lot. So I really appreciate that tie to the community in that way. And Seelig, if you just explain real quick for those that are watching that don't know who Seelig was, even though we have a street named after him.
Well, not just a street, but some of the oldest platted lots in Montrose it's the town of Montrose and the Seelig addition, right? And so he was just one of the founding fathers of our city, and actually created a city even before we were actually officially a county, if I recall. So yeah.
Really important names. I mean, Hartman, Seelig, Catlin. I mean, you can run down the list.
Absolutely.
And, interesting. So there was a cool flag in there. I thought the Uncompahgre Valley irrigation project was really.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that is like a keeper for sure. And I think we were surprised because the telephone directory was like this.
Yeah, and they were all 3-digit numbers.
Yeah.
Right. So give me Hansen 562.
Well,
right?
when you have to do that rotary thing, it was a lot easier to just have.
I'm sure it was more an operator, right?
Yeah. Martha.
Yeah.
One ringy dingy thing. Anyway, it's really a treasure, and I'm glad you're involved. And I think it's really special as our assessor that you maintain all these historical things. And I know when we were moving from the courthouse and then doing the inventory on all our things, you made sure that we kept the old stuff that was in the original courthouse that we could maybe use again, and inventoried it all. And it was important to you. It's important for me too to have some of that furniture and some of those items back in the courthouse.
Absolutely.
Just to have the same feel for what it was. I know that we have to modernize a lot of things like fire doors and things like that, but some of those half glass doors that we had in the admin building originally, really, really cool. What else would you like to draw our attention to before we wrap up here?
Well, I mean, the coin was pretty cool, and the silk flag, I enjoyed that. I mean, a little more tangible items than, because there was mostly paper in there, right? And so, maybe this next round we can put something, I know the sheriff mentioned putting his badge in there, and, maybe a few different interesting things.
Yeah. And then, adding, I mean, what was interesting is that there was, first of all, not many possessions, which I don't know if that was indicative of the time, or, you wouldn't want to give up your badge, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
it was a different time back then.
Right. So, but the lists of people and rosters who belonged to what church, who belonged to what organization, I just found that really interesting. It's really important to me. I mean, I love this community. I know you love this community, and for me to see the tie back to the community is what's to me so important, and that some of those families are still here. So I appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us and explaining all things assessor and why your job is so important, and why, as an elected official, we want to make sure that that your assessor knows what they're doing. And I feel we have the right guy in the place, and I appreciate your service to the county, appreciate your contribution on the historical side of it. So I'm proud to work with you. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Sue.
All right.
All right.